Hi everyone, and I want to thank you for joining our session titled Together Again, AT for Travel and Inclusive Events. My name is Lisa Mathis, and I'm joined up here by my colleague Teresa Goddard. We are both lead consultants at the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, as many people know us. What you can expect for our presentation today: we are going to take a look at JAN's sample 6-step interactive process, which is really just the open communication of an employee requesting an accommodation, working with their employer to implement those reasonable accommodations in the workplace. Then we're going to get into 5 real-life situation and solutions of examples of accommodations of AT that have been implemented to accommodate people in various travels and trainings and event situations. And that's real data from our JAN consultations. And then lastly, quickly, I'm going to go through the A to Z list that you can find for free on the askjan.org website. So if some of you attendees are unfamiliar with what we do at JAN, we're a free national consulting service where we talk to individuals with disabilities about how to request an accommodation and disclose an accommodation if need be. But we also talk to the employer about accommodating people with disabilities and brainstorming and tailoring accommodation ideas that an HR representative may not have thought about that could enable a person with a disability to thrive and succeed in the workplace. So we do that for free. We're funded through the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, and all our services are remote, so people can call in, access the website, or live chat to still get that one-on-one consultation. We do maintain confidentiality. That's very important to us here at JAN, and we really just try to work as your partner in that interactive process. So getting into accommodations for travel and events today, I just wanted to kind of remind everyone that this is not going to be an exhaustive list of accommodations. This is just going to be more practical guidance and better business solutions that we can kind of think about whenever we're planning and promoting our events. So as with everything, you do want to take those requests for accommodation on that case-by-case determination. It's not going to be one size fits all for any situation. Okay, so whenever you're looking at the preparation stage of events, you want to, of course, welcome all participants. And I think it's important at the forefront to disclose what we can expect from that event. Is there going to be special effects? Is there going to be special lighting or strobe lighting? Is it going to be unusually loud in those environments? Is there going to be smoke machines or any irritants that we should be mindful? We want to let people know what to expect and let them make an informed decision if that conference or event is appropriate for them. We're seeing it with CSUN and other national conferences. We're moving towards a hybrid approach. COVID, of course, lended itself to lots of remote events and hybrid approaches, and we're kind of sticking with that because we've seen the value and that people appreciate a hybrid approach. So I think that's a good technique. Every component of an event should be accessible, and if it is not accessible, that could be okay, but you want to communicate that there might be an aspect that's not accessible. We don't want folks with disabilities arriving on site and being blindsided that's something that they can't gain access to that. So communication is very important. If it can't be accessible, tell them what they can expect. Of course, we think it's important whenever you're in your welcome messaging and marketing to invite people to ask for accommodations at the beginning of your planning process. And you don't only want to just ask people if they need accommodations, we want to assign responsibility to who's going to handle those accommodation requests. You don't want it falling flat on someone's desk. So assign responsibility, and the person who has that responsibility should have a baseline knowledge of accommodations, what that means, how to kind of think outside the box of an alternative way of doing something. So all in all, you want to eliminate that disclosure stress. Invite people to request accommodations at the beginning so everyone can feel confident going into that trip or travel. Of course, we see it with CSUN. We want to give people access to personal attendant services, service animals, emotional support animals, give access to those assistive technologies beyond the person themselves. And of course, like I mentioned, if you can't approve an accommodation request, inform that person that that accommodation request couldn't be implemented, and propose alternatives so they can make that informed decision. Okay, moving on to the facility. Of course, there's going to be the baseline accessibility. Typically, public access has that baseline accessibility, but if someone needs further accessibility, you're going to handle that as an accommodation request. So they might need further accessibility than that baseline. So it's important to keep that in mind. So we're being mindful of the paths of travel, emergency egress, restroom accessibility. We're seeing more space for social distancing in that personal bubble. It's not just a COVID aspect anymore. Us with autism or anxiety disorders, we really like to have our space. So have it at a venue large enough so people can have that personal space. In addition to the COVID precautions, for those of us with autoimmune disorders, I think just having room for moving air and social distancing is better business practice in this day and age. I think an important key for facilities is adjustability, whether that's with the temperature, whether that's with the lighting, having people kind of be in control of their environment and it be adjustable. I think that's a key for accommodation. Of course, we see it again with CSUN, the QR code. If you go in the exhibit hall, hardly anyone has full business cards with contact information. It's often just their name and a QR code where you scan it, and that takes you to either emailing them or their website. And that is really helping us of users with assistive technology so we can gain access to that information, because we know that business cards are often inaccessible, whether it's vision issues or cognitive issues, so having an alternative method to gain access is important. At the facility, I think it's important to have appropriate signage. Teresa told me about a case where enough people had made requests for non-binary restroom use, and the hotel facility said, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll convert one of the male restrooms to like a family-style restroom. Well, they only put a sign up on one side, so the other side approaching the restroom still read male restroom. That was a chaotic moment. So if you're going to implement these accommodations, make sure it's successful and effective so we can avoid those awkward run-ins so nobody is kind of put out. So if you're going to have the appropriate signage, make sure you have complete signage and not just half it. Whenever you're planning a facility, I think it's important to kind of train your hotel staff or event staff that, hey, you're going to need to be prepared for various questions, various communication methods from our attendees. So staff is kind of knowledgeable on that front line and disability etiquette and minority etiquette and things like that. So educate the staff, of course. Okay, moving on to the training room or presentation room. Of course, this is a good example where I'm on an elevated platform. There's 3 steps to gain access, but beyond the 3 steps, there is a ramp access, so somebody with a mobility aid can get up here. CSUN does a really good job of that. You'd be surprised that we travel to conferences and things are inaccessible. So be mindful of every aspect of the presentation training room. So not only this platform, but if I have a fine motor limitation and I can't hold a traditional mic, whether an alternative mic should be important, whether that's lapel or the stand mic. Just having alternative methods and adjustability for all equipment and facilities is important. Of course, you want to consider acoustics, multiple mics, provide assistive listening devices, whether that's captioning or interpreters. And then we like a room with multiple power outlets, whether that's to charge a mobility aid, whether that's to function adaptive equipment with assistive technology on it, oxygen tanks, so multiple power outlets is helpful. Okay, so moving on to materials. Of course, we want every aspect of materials, the video, the media, the slides, to be accessible. You want to limit your text on the slides. You want to offer slides afterwards. Y'all can download these slides on the hyperlink within the CSUN website. Include captioning from the start. It's a lot easier and cheaper to have captioning built in from the beginning of your materials than proactively going in after. Of course, we're going to be mindful of alternative interpreting, alternative format. Again, having the alternative format that you've already invited people to request accommodations and then implementing that alternative format that they requested at the onset of the trip. Lots of going green. Again, seeing this in the exhibit hall, the QR codes. People hardly have paper handouts these days. And then having a conference app or a travel app can help the AT users and those with fatigue and weakness issues so they're not lugging around a bunch of materials and brochures. Okay, shifting on to food and beverage. The National Federation of the Blind does recommend that events do a buffet style, meaning you have enough manpower to have servers that can plate the food, explain the food and describe it, and carry it to an attendee's table for them. You want to ask about those dietary needs and restrictions and any food allergies. Of course, you want to have alternative options, but if you're going to go to the lengths of having alternative options, do not cross-contaminate. It's going to be pointless to have alternative options if you're mixing serving utensils and negating the whole point of that. With seating mindfulness, we want to have enough space for mobility aids and service animals. And again, with educating the hotel staff that, hey, we're going to have animals on site, it's going to be around food, and that's A-okay, because they might be thinking about other service animal laws. So just know that in unique circumstances, the animals can be around all facilities. Avoiding candles and fresh flowers is important because lots of us have the hidden, non-apparent disability of allergies and multiple chemical sensitivity, and kind of implementing that fragrance-free policy. Okay. So, of course, all aspects of a trip or event should be inclusive, which can include the transportation, the providing sighted guides, or providing a personal attendant and permitting them to join our trip. We should be mindful of that. I think it's important for conference organizers to do pre-site evaluations, looking at materials, access points, elevator and ramp access. Are there enough restrooms available? And you also want to think beyond just the training location. The nearby restaurants, are they accessible? Because we all don't just stay in this hotel. We sometimes go explore Anaheim. So let's make sure that there's enough outside fun that's truly accessible so we can gain the access to that as well. The hotel guest rooms is also an important aspect, of course. Okay, shifting to looking at ADA compliance for outside training. The EEOC guidance does say that accommodations must be implemented absent hardship so an employee can attend training programs. So that could be alternative format or interpreters, so an employee with a disability can ensure equal opportunity. That extends to both in-house training and outside entity training. And it doesn't matter if you're on the employer premises or you're on an outside premises. So here, things can get a little tricky because both parties are going to be held to the ADA. We have Title I, which is the employer needs to furnish accommodations, but also Title III, which is the trainer, needs to furnish accessibility and accommodations. So they both have these obligations. Neither party should dodge their obligation under the federal law. So practical guidance in this situation, specify in those employment training contracts who's going to furnish what accommodations. Is it going to be the employer does XYZ accommodations and the trainer does this set of accommodations? Really emphasize that in those employment contracts before situations arise, because things may need to be timely, and sometimes it's a little harder to get accommodations on the fly. Okay, moving on to personal attendant services. Again, another form of an accommodation. A personal attendant service is typically the toileting, grooming, and dietary needs, those needs that exist both on the job and off the job. Well, if an employee has an inability to rely on their typical personal attendant service, the ADA says an employer must provide a personal attendant at all times on work-related travel. And if the regular personal attendant is available, then the employer must pay the additional travel costs for that regular personal attendant. And federal law has a little bit of different requirements for personal attendant because federal government does say that we're going to furnish a PAS, but Title I, private industry, a PAS is only needed for work-related travel. So if you have like nitty-gritty questions about personal attendant as a workplace accommodations, definitely give us a call. And now we're going to get into some situation and solutions from the Jan study, and I'm going to hand it over to Teresa.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. I'm Teresa Goddard. I'm also with the Job Accommodation Network. Lisa and I are both employed by the Job Accommodation Network, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some examples that are drawn from Jan's casework. These examples are also representative of the types of examples that are used in the Jan study, which is a study in which Jan studies the costs and benefits of reasonable accommodation. We don't have cost benefit for the examples presented today because some of them are so new that we don't yet know if they're going to be randomly selected to be in our data set. But I hope you enjoy them. This is my favorite part of the show, Jan story time. I'm going to tell you about some real-life cases that Lisa and I and other folks at Jan have handled. So first, I'd like to tell you about an employee with rheumatoid arthritis who was planning a presentation at a national conference, much like this one. She was to be on an expert panel. Now, typically at this conference, some conferences have one microphone for each speaker on the panel. At this particular conference, they usually had one, a handheld microphone that they would pass from person to person. So during conference registration, the conference offered an opportunity to make them aware of any accommodation needs. So that's exactly what this person did. She wrote in her conference registration materials that she would require accommodation because she could not grip or handle a traditional microphone. And so in this particular case, the conference staff made sure that the training room was equipped with a table mic along with a lapel mic so that the presenter had options once they arrived on site. Now, I've seen this handled in other ways. I have on occasion seen conferences offering personal assistance, someone to hold the microphone for the person. And I've also seen people provided with an individual stand microphone. There are lots of different ways to handle this. The important thing for a conference to do, of course, is to give people an opportunity to request accommodations well in advance, because it can be very awkward if you arrive on site and suddenly realize your accommodation needs. And we're going to see that in another example coming up. So in this next example, we have such a situation where the individual with the disability did not realize that they would need an accommodation until they arrived at the event. A physician's assistant was attending a medical conference. Once they got on site, they noticed that the facility used fluorescent lighting, which for them caused vision issues and migraines. So this particular person had migraines as well as dry eye and had difficulty tolerating bright lights. And I can literally feel their pain. I'm going to be taking a migraine med right after we leave here today. Since the accommodation need wasn't realized by either party before the conference, The attendee opted for a less than optimal accommodation. She wound up sitting in the hallway outside of the training room because the conference said that they could not adjust the lighting in the hall without unduly impacting others. They hadn't planned ahead for this possibility, and they told her they could only lower the lights in the hallway. So a better business practice in a situation like this would be to be prepared to adjust lighting if possible, as well as having alternate options. Some conferences will offer an alternate viewing space where people can participate via a video link, or they may be able to offer a space that is somewhat shielded from light, from external noise, or from whatever it might be impacting the person. We do see this sometimes with a fragrance-free zone within a presentation room as well. Other things that can be helpful include utilizing presentation slides on a mobile app or emailing to attendees beforehand, just in case they can't sit in a place where they can readily view the slides, permitting self-regulated breaks, flexible seating, and alternate attire as needed. The reason I say this is this individual did try to prepare. She brought her absorptive filters, which are like sunglasses in some ways. They block part of the light spectrum. But the conference organizers didn't understand what she was wearing and had some objections that made her feel uncomfortable wearing her absorptive filters to filter the light and protect herself. And that was, not only rude, but also poor accommodation. And when she became upset about someone questioning her need for these absorptive filters, they said she was being disruptive. So I would hope that going forward, conferences consider that a person asking for accommodation and explaining their needs is acting very much appropriately. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit because we have a lot of these to get through, and Lisa has a little more content too. Sorry, interpreter, I'm about to go into Zoom mode. So in this situation, an attendee with a fragrance allergy was attending a work-related training. They were concerned about what irritants they might encounter at the site. So the attendee contacted the conference and learned that they were encouraging employees to be fragrance-free during the event. Well, that's good. It might not be perfect, but at least it's a step in the right direction. The employee also brought masks suitable for mitigating fragrance with them and took self-regulated breaks as a precaution. Fresh air breaks, like to go outside or to a less populated area. The attendee also asked if room doors could be left open for better ventilation. Now, when we're talking about masks, there are a lot of options. At JAN, we do maintain a database of vendors that carry various things, including masks. And we have gotten some good feedback on a few different types of masks. While we can't endorse or recommend products or vendors, we have had good feedback on P95 type masks, such as those that are sold by large manufacturing warehouses like Grainger. And we've also had some good feedback on masks with a carbon filter. So one example of that would be the honeycomb pollution mask, which is made by the I Can Breathe mask company. So people can take some steps to protect themselves, but even the best mask won't protect someone from overwhelming fragrances in their environment. If a conference venue can improve ventilation in any way, that can be extremely helpful. And if I were to receive a request like this for an event that I was organizing, I would probably also want to rent an air purifier that was rated for the size of space that the person might encounter in the training rooms, and have that on and going at events that they were planning to attend or sessions that they were planning to attend. So that would be a better business practice to encourage fragrance-free policies. Make sure you mention on the registration materials, and maintain ventilation, and possibly consider some air purifiers. Next, we have a hard of hearing example. An attendee who was hard of hearing wanted to attend a movie screening that was taking place at the conference. So they contacted the conference to see, hey, will captioning be available? And the conference staff contacted the venue to ensure that that happened. A better business practice is to ensure that your venues are following accessibility guidelines. And even at conferences that do very well, confusion can occur. I was in a session earlier where someone was sure that there would be captioning, and in fact, there wasn't. So there was a little bit of a last-minute scramble to make sure that this person had access to the session. Okay, next, I want to talk about an example with regard to personal needs related to toileting. A speaker with irritable bowel syndrome was presenting at a professional development workshop. They were concerned about urgency to use the restroom during their hour-long session. They made an accommodation request to the event planners, and this is what they asked for. They wanted a room that was closer to a restroom that would enable them to get there very quickly, right before the session, right after. And if they were to have an urgent need mid-session, they would be very close by. Great time for a breakout discussion, right? So a better business practice is to consider event locations that have loads of restrooms, build in lots of break time, and also give people maps so that they can find those easily. You can also temporarily modify restrooms based on accommodation needs with signage, as Lisa discussed earlier. There are also events that will rent equipment that a person may need in the restroom, such as a Hoyer lift. Okay, and next I have an example involving someone with vision who had travel-related accommodation needs. So this was an interesting case. Some of you may be familiar with IRA, A-I-R-A, and the IRA I.O. app. So that's used to access sighted assistance while you're on the go through an app. This particular employee had the app and used it a lot in her personal life. She was a big fan of this app. But because her work setting was federal and had many security requirements, she was unable to use it while in her workplace. The employer was prepared to provide her with personal assistance services during travel, but she wanted to be more independent. So the employer decided to grant her request to use the IRA.io app for work-related travel instead of a personal assistant, as the employer requested. It is a better business practice to give primary consideration to an employee's first choice in accommodation options. So we've talked about some real-life examples. Next, I want to tell you about a few things that we have heard about from Jan's callers, things that they think are nice to have, but that aren't always provided at accessible events. One amenity that can be helpful both to those without disabilities and those with disabilities is a medical needs room, a designated space that people can use for any medical-related need, whether nursing, administering an injectable, testing one's blood sugar. And it's good if this space can have a refrigerator in case someone has to refrigerate foods that they need to eat at certain times of day, or if they need access to a refrigerator for medications. Now, I do think it's a good idea for the attendee to consider bringing a lockbox or like a bank bag that has a lock on it so that they can secure their items within a shared refrigerator. A sensory-friendly area is also a great amenity for those who may be neurodivergent or who just become overwhelmed easily when around a lot of people. Soft lighting, low noise, and providing items such as fidgets could help a person to calm down in between sessions or to recover after being overwhelmed either by environmental factors like lighting or noise, or just from needing a break from being around other people for a few moments. Restroom availability is absolutely key for everyone. Providing gender-neutral restrooms as a default can be extremely helpful because it can be awkward for someone to have to approach and ask, well, could you modify one of these restrooms to make it gender neutral? Having to do that on the day of a conference, it just can be awkward. Planning ahead is a best practice, a better business practice. And as Lisa mentioned, you absolutely want clear signage on these things. The very last thing you want is an awkward moment where a restroom is not functioning as indicated because the signage is unclear. Finally, having a point of contact, a person or a group of people that can be easily identified and contacted about accessibility issues while on site can make the whole event go much more smoothly. No matter how much you plan, there will always be a need that arises on site, and it's better to have someone designated who can deal with that in an empathetic and sensitive manner. Providing that person's contact information or contact information for, say, accommodations at XYZ conference could be a helpful step. Okay, Lisa, I've left you a few minutes for your content. And hopefully Lisa will leave us enough time for some Q&A. Take it away, Lisa.
Okay, so let me erase this. So I did just want to take a moment to show you guys an interactive process. All the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says is, yeah, an employer and an employee requesting accommodations, they should work together in an interactive process. But of course, they did not outline what that looks like in a perfect world. So we at JAN have developed this sample 6-step process, starting with step 1, recognizing an accommodation request. Step 2, gathering information. Step 3, exploring accommodation options. Step 4, choosing an accommodation. Step 5, implementing that accommodation. And then this step is always forgotten, monitoring that accommodation. Employers will furnish accommodation and it works great for 6 months, but software changes and databases change and evolve and the way we do business changes and evolve. And then boom, that accommodation is now ineffective. So maintain those accommodations is a crucial part to that interactive process. If you want more information about that interactive process, we do have a sample publication on the askjan.org website. But if y'all are unfamiliar with the Job Accommodation Network, I would recommend all people start with the A to Z listings, and I just wanted to walk through those real quick. So if you go to askjan.org, there's an A to Z listing, and it can help you populate accommodation considerations depending on what information you have. So if you just know the disability, you would click on the By Disability tab. So pretend we clicked into that. And so often there's going to be longer publications with some basic information about that disability or medical condition. There's going to be key accommodations, which just means that's what we see most often, people requesting for that associated disability. And it gives you some food for thought and things to consider when working with someone with that said disability. Let's pretend that we clicked into the tab by limitation. So someone didn't specifically disclose what their disability was, but we know they're having a hard time with this. Then we would click on that limitation. If you happen to know that limitation, whether it's memory or cognition or fine manipulation, click into that and accommodation ideas will populate based on that limitation. So pretending we clicked into hard of hearing, like Teresa mentioned, we do have this database of vendor lists that houses all this assistive technology of potential options that an employer or an employee can consider. While we don't recommend or endorse any one product over another, we just try to give our customers the information that we know is available, what's on the market, and where to find it, that may be feasible in their work environment for their job task. Okay, so let's pretend we clicked into by topic. This is going to be those things that aren't really directly related to a disability, but we see in the ADA in an interactive process. So common issues with that is the parking, light duty, or conduct issues. And that will come up with some EEOC guidances and articles that Jan consultants have written to address those issues within the workplace. Okay, so let's pretend we clicked on by topic and clicked into accessibility. Based on the subject matter of this session, I wanted to kind of do a screenshot of clicking into accessibility. And on that website, you'll see lots of checklists, often from outside resources that we know is available, that talk about in-person accessibility, virtual accessibility, recruiting and hiring accessibility. So there's a lot of information on our accessibilities page. And then lastly, the last tab on the A to Z listing is by accommodation. These are just common accommodations under the ADA. They're not an exhaustive list. Again, they're just the most common ones we see as Jan callers are requesting. So you can get more detailed information on accessible information and facilities, supervisory methods, perhaps as an accommodation, a modified schedule, or a policy modification. So if you're unfamiliar with Jan, I would start with the A to Z listings. I'm going to leave our screen up with our contact information, but we do have a booth in the exhibit hall. We're at number 315, and we're there until 1:30 today. So I hope you all stop by, and I appreciate you coming today. Thank you. Yeah. So I think we do have like 5 minutes for questions if anyone wants to raise their hand, and we'll try to answer those. Anybody? Okay, well, our phone number, if you want to reach out and talk privately, is 800-526-7234, or you can visit us on our website at askjan.org, which is askjan.org. And then you can also send us an email at jan@askjan.org. And we are beefing up our individual resources on the Ask Jan website, giving customers more tools to add to their accommodation toolbox, whether that's for requesting accommodations, disclosure tips and tricks, templates for putting a formal request in writing. So we're definitely adding more to the individual page. So if you've visited us before, check back in here and the rest of this month, because we're definitely adding to it. Thank you again.